So I started reading, as I was studying the Torah portion, my plan was to teach on this week's Torah portion and related to our group in our meditation. It's called Shoftim, and I realized there was so much in it that I thought I would probably do a mini series on the Torah portion rather than try and stuff a whole bunch of stuff into one session and bore you to death. Rather just do like 10, 15 minutes teaching for 3 or 4 times. But it's really a very, I think, magnificent portion. And it tells us really a lot of practical things, right? So maybe some of you have browsed now recently because it's the Torah portion, or you've done it in the past. It's Deuteronomy 16:8 through 17:13, if you're interested. But basically, the backdrop is, the freedom from slavery in Exodus, and going through wanderings in the desert, and all of the things that we learn from in our own lives of our own freeing ourselves from mental slavery or any kind of slavery, and then that experience of being sort of out there with uncertainty and dealing with our own vulnerabilities that enable us to grow higher and higher and higher states of consciousness and connection with God within ourselves and each other and around us, like that, But now we're in Devarim, which is Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Torah, and basically it's bringing us into the promised land, that higher state of consciousness, we'll say, for our sake. I'm not saying there isn't a relation to geography and history, there is, but when we think about it for our meditation and our lives and so on and so forth, I think it's from that level that we can gain the most instruction, and we know that that's what Torah means, instruction. So in this Shoftim, the last Torah portion is talking about these holidays that we're going to have to celebrate, all these holidays, Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah, and do these things together, and it's beautiful and fun. And then comes the idea of, in this Torah portion, the practicalities of governance, right? So I think this is front and center for all of us, and I don't want this to turn into sort of any kind of modern day political Torah portion, but what I want it to be more is, how does it relate to us and our journeys into higher states of consciousness? These 32, according to Sefer Yetzirah, Shloshim v'shtayim netivot pliyot chachma, these 32 marvelous and mystical paths of enlightenment, right? So if we look at this Torah portion, and I'll read the first couple of verses, it gets real practical right from the get-go. Appoint yourself judges and officers for your tribe in all your settlements that God, your Lord, will be giving you, and make sure that they administer honest judgment for the people. Do not bend justice. Do not give special consideration to anyone. Do not take bribes. Bribery makes the wise blind and perverts the words of the righteous. Pursue perfect honesty so that you will live and occupy the land that God, your Lord, is giving you. So this is pretty lofty compared to what we're used to, right? So even though the tribes certainly have um, authority figures, and throughout the wandering, there was established authority figures. Now that we're going into the land, there's this whole platform laid out by God to say, hey, you're going to live together, you're going to live in your tribes near one another, and you're gonna be looking to have a peaceful life and a life of joy and a life of happiness, right? So in order to do that, you need to have justice. So justice is the key sort of theme in this Torah portion, and one of the themes of it is honesty and treating each other, and the judges treating us, or the people that we choose to be judges. And God is telling us, choose these judges and make sure they're honest, make sure they're not prejudiced in any way or biased, and make sure that they don't accept bribes. These are basic things, right? So if we want to turn this back on ourselves, rather than looking at trying to, put this on our government or other governments or whatever, I mean, we can do that on our own. What we want to do is we want to say the Kabbalistic way is that group consciousness, right, is what affects government. So that the government is a reflection of the consciousness of the group of people. So, it's easy to blame our kings and queens and judges and Supreme Courts and all that. But really, according to Kabbalism and also Vedic mysticism, those things always reflect the group consciousness of the peoples. So what is that? It's a vibrational energy, right? It's not that the group consciousness is always the same. It's often very divided. But if it's divided, then that's what's reflected in the energy of that consciousness. Does that make sense? So if people are at war with one another or unloving to one another, right, then that's reflected in that group consciousness, which is reflected in their choices of the judges, of the government that we speak of in this Torah portion, right? So that, with that knowledge, we're able to look at this Torah portion as a reflection of ourselves instead of a reflection of our government or whatever. Oh, they're dishonest or they're this and that. No, well, if that's true, and it may well be throughout the world, what is that a reflection of? It's a reflection of the group consciousness of the people. So we want to look at it that way. So what I want to do is first turn our attention back to where this word Israel pops up, right? And once again, I'm cautioning us to say, okay, this is not a discussion about the government in Israel or whatever. It is in a way, but that's not what we're really focusing on. And that's up to you to think about beyond this. But what this study is about us and our honesty and how we judge, and that the commandments are coming to us here in Deuteronomy for ourselves to be honest, for ourselves to judge with less bias, right? And how that happens. And it goes throughout the portion in a very practical and pragmatic way. But I first want to go all the way back to Genesis, when this idea of Israel first comes up. And of course, it's Jacob, right? And this is Genesis 32, verses 22 to 31. And being a numerologist, I don't think it's an accident that this particular verse, which is really an amazing sort of touchstone in the Torah, is Genesis 32, Shloshim V'Shtayim, 32 paths, 22, of course, 22 letters, right? So anyway, let me read this. Jacob, this is, spent the night in the camp. In the middle of the night, he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 handmaids, his 11 sons, and sent them across the Jacobok River. After he had taken them and sent them across, he also sent across all his possessions. So Jacob remained alone, a stranger. And this is critical, right? So here he is. He's about to have this incredible spiritual experience. And he has it on his own. He sends his family across the river. He sends all his possessions across the river. And here he is in the middle of the night by himself, right? And this transformative experience he's about to have is between him and God. So as he has this experience and we put ourselves in his shoes, we need to understand that no one else can have this experience for us. None of our heroes, none of our rabbis, none of the prophets we believe in, whatever it may be, it's between you and God, right? Pretty important. I said a stranger. A stranger is part of the second sentence, the next sentence. A stranger appeared and wrestled with him until just before daybreak. When the stranger saw that he could not defeat him, he touched the upper joint of Jacob's thigh. Jacob's hip joint became dislocated as he wrestled with the stranger. Let me leave, the stranger said. Dawn is breaking. I will not let you leave until you bless me. What is your name? Jacob replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be said to be Jacob, but your name will be Israel. Now, the interesting thing is, as we go further on in Jacob's life, sometimes he's called Israel and sometimes he's called Jacob. So this name Israel really is, at least in my opinion and opinion of many commentators, is really a title which has to do with, it literally means to have struggled with God, El, Israel, at the end. El is God, Yisrael, struggle. To have struggled with God and prevailed. And he did this on his own, and this name was given to him. He didn't toss out the name Jacob, and it was never used again. It was used again in the Torah. So why am I bringing this up for the Torah portion in Devarim of Shoftim? It's because the understanding of who is talking to who and what it means to be righteous or honest, it's a struggle, right? So the message here is obviously to Jacob's children. And Jacob's children are Israel. Why? Because they struggle with God and prevail. And how do they struggle? They struggle with truth. They struggle with honesty. They struggle with righteousness. And that's what shows up in this Torah portion. It's not, a big, festival, a big cruise in the Mediterranean Sea, where we're all just drinking and eating whatever we want. These paths, these Shloshim V'Shtayim, Netivot, Pliot, these are paths of struggle. And Abraham Abulafia talks about this as borders of consciousness that we cross. And whenever we're crossing one of these borders to a higher state of consciousness, and together having a higher state of group consciousness, which circles back to the original point, if we want a benevolent government, a government that creates peace and happiness for its people, it has to be a reflection of the consciousness of its people. So the consciousness of its people is a higher, honest, unbiased, truthful consciousness. And it goes into more detail about what that higher consciousness is as we get into the teeth of the Torah portion. It takes wrestling with those things. It takes crossing that border. So what we always have is we always have these two things going on. Number one is pushing that klipot, that stone from the well, which Jacob did even before he had this wrestling match, and experiencing that pure consciousness, experiencing that higher consciousness within ourselves. And that's the chachma part, that's the wisdom part. And then thrashing it out is in the level of binah, the level of understanding. How do we understand that wisdom we just had? Thrashing that out means struggling. Struggling with what's right and wrong with God. In prayer, in your regular life, in study. And these answers don't often come quickly. This blessing doesn't often come quickly. And it involves sometimes some arduous things in life and in our struggle to come across that border. But each time we come across that border, we gain a higher consciousness and more of the happiness that's really, as we'll discover as we go further into this Torah portion, that's really important. And then that translates into what's really important in our group consciousness. So to go further in that Torah portion itself, Shoftim, it goes on now, begins to talk about idolatry as a problem. So we're talking about, here we are about to enter the Holy Land. All the tribes are going to have their certain places to live. Establish yourself, judges in these tribes. Establish yourself, officers of the police officers, even, could say, to make justice, to have justice, to impart justice. It's a merciful thing to have justice. Let me get into, do not plant for yourselves a shira or any other tree near the altar that you will make yourselves for Yod He Vav He Elohim. In other words, in context, that particular tree was a tree that was used by the Canaanites, which were going into their land, for the purpose of idolatry. They worshiped that tree. So we love trees. We see God in trees. We even have a new year of the trees, right? But the tree itself is not God. We don't worship the tree as God. We see the essence of everything in nature as God. So now we come across idolatry, and idolatry throughout the Torah is an issue. And why is it an issue? Because it simply prevents our soul from union with Ein Sof, with God within ourselves. Anything we get stuck on. So the next point is really very interesting. Do not erect a sacred pillar, since this is something that God, your Lord, Yud He Vav He, Elohim, hates. That's really interesting. Why? Because sacred pillars God loved in the past. All the patriarchs erected pillars of stone and made sacrifices to God on these pillars. Wherever they traveled, they erected pillars of stones. Now God hates pillars. Don't erect any pillars of stone. So there's an evolutionary process to these 32 paths of higher consciousness. What was okay for us when we're trying to achieve that very first path of higher consciousness may not be okay when we're trying to achieve the 18th path of higher consciousness, right? So we're open, you know, when at the burning bush, God says to Moses, when I go to Pharaoh, who shall I tell him sent me? He says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, right? This is the becoming. This is God becoming God. So itself is always the same, without end. But in the relative, the expression of that Ein Sof, in the relative, even in the finest relative, is always changing. And as such, this is a beautiful act of mercy, really. Because what may be evolutionary spiritually to us today may not be tomorrow. Does that make sense? Right? So even, let's say, just to keep it simple, something we eat. It may be a big blessing to eat a certain thing at a certain state of consciousness. And then suddenly at another state of consciousness, we can know that eating that thing is not working for us in our state of consciousness. And a very simple thought, but that pertains to anything. So it means that we're changing. And that every time we cross a border, we change. So we don't erect monuments to our current state of consciousness. If we erect a monument to our current state of consciousness, it becomes an idol. And what does God hate? He hates idols. Why? As they said, because it keeps us there. I might have mentioned this to you in another study, and a lot of these things I've mentioned. But I was taught about these 32 states of consciousness and higher states of consciousness to think of it as like being on a river in a boat. And we come to a city and we park the boat and we enjoy that city, and it's beautiful and it's that higher state of consciousness. But we don't want to be stuck there. So we get in the boat and we go further down the river of consciousness to another city and another city and another higher state of consciousness. If we erect a monument and love this one particular city in Italy so well, the Patella, we'll be stuck in the Patella forever, right? And this is the point of these structures and monuments. This is the point that we don't get stuck. Especially in our meditation, we dive deep within. Whatever thought we may be having, we may have a completely blissful experience of God within ourselves or within a tree around us. But we don't want to limit God to that experience or limit our consciousness to that experience. We want to allow whatever happens, whatever we receive next. Okay? And one last point before we go further. In the next, when we get to chapter 17 now, there's a real big focus on idolatry and a capital punishment for idolatry. But it also talks about if for any capital crime, now we're getting into the weeds of how things are judged. For any capital crime, there has to be two witnesses, two eyewitnesses. So the obvious thing there is we don't want to, kill someone, God forbid, of a capital crime if they didn't do it. So God's saying there must be two eyewitnesses for that to ever happen, which is really unique even in our day and age, because a person can be put in jail forever or even executed without an eyewitness. Just if the prosecutor presents enough evidence, even if it's circumstantial, that the jury feels this person can be convicted. God's saying is no such conviction without two eyewitnesses. But on a deeper level, the Kabbalists say what this really means is the two witnesses are pure consciousness first, and then the relative experience of the act. So first we touch pure consciousness. It's like the Aleph, pure consciousness is the first witness. And then the Yud, the activity, the catalyst for activity. So it's like having, and sometimes a third witness, the Torah says. Let me read you that Torah portion. Any accused shall be put to death only with the testimony of two or three witnesses. He shall not be put to death through the testimony of one witness. And remember, we shall pursue perfect honesty so that you will live and occupy the land that God, your Lord, is giving you. So that third witness, it's like if you've been initiated into the three mother letters, the Aleph is that pure silent letter. And it represents Ein Sof, which is pure consciousness. This is what a real judge would have to touch before he could have any real judgment on any situation, touching pure consciousness. So that flow, the rocks moved from that well, from the mouth of the well, and that flow of that water, pure consciousness. Pure silence within, the Holy of Holies within us, is the first witness. That's our witness. And then Mem and Shin is moved by the Yud. Kabbalists say this is the first holy name of God, these two things. The Yud and the Aleph, or the Yud and the Hey, represents the absolute and relative sphere. So we're combining them. If you've heard the Sefer Yetzirah classes, we talk about the word chazmal. When I taught on Ezekiel's a chariot on his vision, the word chazmal is there. What is that word chazmal? It means electricity, and that's what he's experiencing. But that chazmal is a combination of silence and speaking at the same time. So in order for this judgment, in order for any judgment we have in life to be righteous and honest, it needs to be a combination of those two things: silence and activity, unity field of consciousness and relative field of consciousness. Those two things must exist. If it's just relative, you're just judging based on the relative experience, too often the judgment will be wrong. But if you're established in that pure silence, established in unity, established in Ein Sof, and then judging the relative, absolute relative, then you can't go wrong with your judgment. That's the point. That's the Kabbalistic point of these two things. So that's how the honesty and the righteousness happens in the verse. Seek perfect honesty in your judges, in your government, because that's what you are as a people. As a people, you're touching pure consciousness, and you experience then that flow of that pure consciousness, which, as the Sephirah tells us, is wisdom, understanding, and mercy. All of these things, all of the Sephirah combined. So that's what God is saying, to seek in your judges when he tells us we'll establish judges in the land of Israel. And what is Israel itself? It's the willingness to wrestle for that honesty and truth at each stage of our developing consciousness. I hope that makes some sense. And I'll continue that for maybe one or two more lessons as this Torah portion goes on with the creation of these judges and Sanhedrin and even a king and all that. But I hope that puts a good foundation for us to look at those things.